I'm sitting here on Copacabana Beach in Rio de Janeiro, and my name's John Urry. I'm a Professor of Sociology, and I've been particularly interested in the past in all sorts of aspects of the ways in which tourism has developed, has transformed places, and has transformed people's lives, both the people who are receiving tourists and those who are visiting. And Copacabana is obviously one of the iconic tourist destinations around the world. But in recent years I've got more and more interested in some of the environmental and energy implications of mass tourism, and in a way much more generally in mass travel and what I call mobilities. And I've been writing a series of books analysing, critiquing mobilities. And in recent years I've published a book called Climate Change and Society, which tries to look at how the social sciences should be inserting themselves into the climate change debates. Climate change, sciences show, depends upon human behaviour, and doing anything about the mitigation of climate change requires transforming human behaviour, and yet much of the time the approaches that within the social sciences have been relatively small and rather limited. So sitting here on Copacabana Beach as a sort of iconic destination for global tourism is sort of fascinating, but also troubling and worrying. I mean, one of the implications of climate change is the development of extreme weather events and the likelihood of changes in world sea levels. And that is in a way being brought about by extreme consumption and rising consumption around the world of fossil fuels, and particularly the fossil fuel of oil. This beach is entirely dependent really on oil, which has enabled people to travel here by car and bus, and particularly to have arrived here by air travel. Over 95% of transportation energy is based upon oil, and oil is a very troubling substance because it both is running out and also creates greenhouse gas emissions, which would appear to be raising temperatures. And of course many beaches, which are the places which attract tourists, will be some of the first places to get washed away if and when sea levels rise significantly. So the beach is such a sort of emblematic place of contestation in the 21st century. I think the reasons why the social sciences have been behindhand in addressing issues of changing climates is partly because other subjects and other disciplines have kind of got there first. Obviously, there are various climate sciences, and they had developed programs of research, funding, journals and so on, which didn't really take account of and allow in social science approaches. And also I think the social sciences operated on the basis of the division of kind of academic labour. Social science dealt with society, and the physical sciences dealt with the physical world. And the only social science that made significant inroads really has been economics. But economics, I think, is a problematic social science in various ways, one of which is that it tends to concentrate on individual behaviour and on how to adjust market mechanisms so as to bring about changes in individual behaviour. And that sort of individualism is not helpful, I think, in the development of a sort of a good social science to deal with the issues of changing climates. And this is something that means that the social sciences have to sort of significantly insert themselves into and try to transform the whole array of academic disciplines and subjects. The division between the sort of the physical world and the social world is very unsatisfactory, very problematic, and in a way what the proper approach to thinking out the issues of climate change will have to be multidisciplinary, or what we might call even post-disciplinary, going beyond disciplines and particularly drawing out the incredibly significant interconnections of physical processes and social processes. But this requires both the physical sciences to be somewhat transformed, but it also requires the social sciences to be somewhat transformed as well, and to try to develop new ways of thinking, particularly, I think, in relationship to the significance of what I call socio-technical systems. So systems which are very important, such as air travel or mass tourism, are sort of simultaneously social and technical, and neither one nor the other. But developing that analysis is a major task. And these socio-technical systems are really significant because what they do is to set up various kinds of social practices, sort of enduring social practices that are sort of embodied and embedded in people's lives, and they create various sorts of habits. And it's these habits which are so sort of powerful, pervasive, such as the habit of going on holiday to a beach as though that's natural. And of course it's absolutely anything but natural. It's a sort of socially constructed process, has produced various sorts of habitual practice, habitual action, and which almost certainly will have to be reversed. I mean, I suppose so the issue that we're discussing here is adaptation, and I'm fairly convinced that in the long term there will have to be adaptation, but adaptation is troublesome. It involves a lot of costs, and to some degree also involves a lot of energy, which is particularly troubling. Especially as I believe that there are certain sources of energy which have peaked. So if there is a peaking of oil, and some people say there's about to be a peaking of gas supplies, then adaptation, which requires a lot of energy, is difficult to bring about. I mean, for me, I think we shouldn't give up on the idea that societies can be put into reverse gear. And in the talk that I gave at the forum, I was trying to advocate what it would take to reverse a variety of systems and practices. And for me, that's the most important thing. It may be there will be adaptation kind of later down the line. But I think partly because of the issue of energy, I think adaptation is an unsatisfactory way of proceeding. Well, I think over the course of the 20th century, what developed were a series of astonishingly powerful socio-technical systems linked together, forming a cluster, and they came to generate a powerful set of processes of high carbon living, high carbon practices, high carbon habits. And those occurred over the course of the 20th century, and they sort of initiated in the United States and then spread through Western Europe, and now of course in a way through and across much of the world, including, as we see around us, in Brazil, one of the most rapidly expanding economies and societies. That has produced a situation where, for example, the Earth seems to demand too many resources are being used up too quickly, and so the only way of dealing adequately with that would be to reverse those high carbon systems. And that requires not just doing one thing different, but it requires a kind of cluster of low carbon systems, practices and habits. And that is a very tremendously significantly difficult thing to bring about. And so there are many sort of forces that make it unlikely that one can do that. Partly, of course, because of the power of the very corporations and states that have interests in the continued expansion of what I call high carbonism. I also, just in passing, think that what we should be trying to develop is sort of post-carbon thinking, post-carbonism, a bit like postmodernism, but post-carbonism. And that would require trying to undermine and reverse those systems, and that would involve a radical degree of localization. The localizing, which would mean that beaches like this were only occupied by people living locally, friendships, family life, corporations, business and so on, professions would be re-localized. People would seek to find pleasure in visiting not the global iconic beach, but their local beach or local attraction and so on. So it requires sort of full-scale reclustering of low carbon systems and practices. The issue as to how we move to a low carbon set of systems is obviously a tremendous challenge, and in this book on climate change and society I discuss various future scenarios. One of those future scenarios is a sort of planned powering down in which there's a relatively benign set of processes which involve the reclustering of low carbon systems. But I also think that the chances of that happening are relatively limited. It's possible, but I also discuss various alternatives. One alternative is a much more sort of contestatory and conflictual, what I sometimes call the Mad Max 2 scenario, in which there are very extensive resource wars. There is a lot of kind of competition and fights over land, water, food, energy and so on, and in which there's a kind of forced or an enforced powering down, in which many systems are descaled, localized, precisely because there are just not the resources and so on sufficient to keep them going. I also discuss another alternative which I call sort of digital worlds, which is the possibility that vast amounts of travel, resources and so on are replaced by sort of digitized experiences, so that people come to think that actually you don't need to go to the beach, you just are presented with digital images, obviously of various kinds of sophistication, which can come to be thought of as like the real thing, and indeed that you don't need to face the place, and you don't need to have face-to-face contact. You can, through various sorts of enhanced, digitized futures, kind of in a way replace the physical travel and the physical encounters with digital encounters and experiences. Well, I think the writings of James Lovelock on Gaia, showing the Earth system as a kind of single entity, have been fantastically productive, and of course in a way have come to now to be taken pretty seriously by a lot of mainstream science, and it's pretty helpful for, I think, social scientists. One of the things in that approach is very much the idea of systems thinking, and of the ways in which you can have tipping points and positive feedback mechanisms which can take systems well away from equilibrium, which is what he roughly describes in relationship to the Earth system. And that would be very much part of my understanding of the systems which characterize the sort of socio-technical world as well. That is, that there are systems, they don't move necessarily towards equilibrium, they can be characterized by positive feedbacks which move the system further and further away from equilibrium and into often sort of catastrophic kinds of dysfunctional features. There's no doubt that there has become a kind of global agenda of events, protocols, procedures and so on, of which the latest Rio Summit Rio +20 is just another example. And in a way the sort of the global calendar is itself punctuated by these sorts of events, and they are themselves part of the global calendar, and they're kind of part of the problem of a high carbon world. But at the same time, the ways in which the global debates have proceeded since the first Rio summit, a 20-year period, is pretty significant, and suggests that the kinds of developments that are taking place are the developments taking place at this Rio are very significant. It may be that this is one relatively, not exactly the last chance saloon, but getting close to the last chance saloon, because of the ways in which so many of the processes in the atmosphere are irreversible. The degrees of the emissions in the atmosphere sort of stay in that atmosphere for hundreds of years. It's very difficult to imagine the kind of rate of reversal that will be necessary, and so one would have to be hopeful that something pretty dramatic comes out of Rio. And there are two things there. One is a kind of global agreement, and I think the reversals requirement that I referred to earlier does require a kind of resetting or a re-emphasis upon certain global agendas. This is absolutely crucial, But of course, the global agendas are only sort of part of a kind of complex of conditions which would have to change. I think sort of at the same time, I'm pretty struck by the significance of kind of small-scale social innovation of a sort which becomes widely significant and requires sort of changing the context in which technology is understood. We should get away from the idea that we can sort of simply develop high technologies that will get us out of this set of interlocking problems. I'm taken by the idea that there can be various sorts of disruptive technologies. I think it's important to think of kind of at least, well, many different levels, but one level is the changing sort of global context, so the setting and the resetting of a global agenda, but also at the same time to seek to enhance, develop the conditions under which local experimentation can take place. And there are indeed, I mean, thousands, probably tens of thousands of experiments taking place with sort of low carbon theory and practice. And I think a really important actually a really important thing for Rio to think about would be how to kind of upscale, enlarge the scale of some of those. And I think the one good thing in a kind of way is the global media and the internet and social media and so on. That has the potential to enlarge, develop on a greater scale many of these social innovation and social practices. So I sort of see that as one possible little good news story, a good news story actually to do with the global media, and thinking of the procedures and activities and mechanisms by which local experimentation on whether it's on transportation or energy or use or recycling can be made much more widespread. So one of the things that I've tried to develop is in a book called Contested Natures, in which one of the points that we tried to make in that book was that there's no sort of single one nature or one physical world which is threatened and which has to be or should be saved. That there are various sorts of various kinds of physical environments and all sorts of different ways in which different groups of people come to seek to influence, change, moderate these different environments. And so one question is whether therefore there ought to be some sort of more kind of universal understanding to try to link these together, or whether one goes with this diversity of different cultures of nature. And I'm prefer in a way to go with the latter. That is that there are lots of different ways in which alternatives can be fought for, and indeed there are many different alternatives. So for example, there is no such thing as simply renewable energy. There are different kinds of energy. All energy requires resources, often quite substantial, often many very substantial resources. There's no simple. So I think kind of trying to impose the solution or the values is probably unhelpful, and we should actually recognise the diversity of different sorts of approaches and so on. However, of course, that does mean lots of analysis and discussion and talk between different people in different sorts of ways. in order to try to sort of bring some common understandings, but not a simple common position. There's an issue as to the relationship between academics or intellectuals and the kinds of emerging politics and social movement around diverse environmental issues. And I quite like the phrase in Gramsci in Prison Notebooks, where he talks about organic intellectuals. And of course he was thinking of the working class movement, but I think there are kind of, in a way, organic intellectuals of the green movement and of feminism and of other contemporary social movements. And I think one of the things that I like about the idea of the organic intellectual is that it's a kind of two-way process. So it's not simply the intellectual telling, instructing, teaching to the social movement, but as a kind of organic relationship between intellectuals and the movement. And obviously, in some ways, aspects of environmental debate, theory, research have been as much developed by the movement, the hundreds of thousands of small groups dotted around the world, their attempts to improvise, experiment, to imagine alternative ways of living in a kind of post-carbon way, and indeed partly developing some of the very technologies which are now being sort of taken over and rolled out by big corporations. So I think it should be a very sort of interdependent relationship between people who are quite good, say, like I suppose myself, at writing books, but drawing on and hopefully not exploiting the sorts of ideas, practices in the what we loosely can call an environmental movement. Well, I think actually, so we're discussing how I personally came to develop an interest in environment, contested natures and so on. And I think it was actually around 1992, around the time of the first Rio Earth Summit. Firstly, I had various research projects in Lancaster University, where I work, which were kind of concerned with issues of travel, the countryside and the environment. And this came out of my general interest in tourism. So, and the effect, some of the sort of widespread effects of tourism on place. And so 1992 was obviously also the moment of the Earth Summit, and that obviously introduced all sorts of terms and debates and issues into the sort of public realm, and I kind of noticed that and hopefully took some cognizance of that. And then I suppose also it was also becoming completely clear that there were things about contemporary capitalist societies that were leading in very undesirable and problematic directions. And of course the 1990s was this period of tremendous sort of expansion and growth of capitalism, which had kind of seen off communism, roughly. And there's a writer, Joseph Stiglitz, for example, who talks of the roaring 1990s. So I was kind of struck by the roaring 1990s, and yet at the same time there was this sort of sense of theory, debate and practice which was sort of seeking to contest and to subvert some of those roaring 1990s. So we're discussing now the sort of the nature of sociology and its relationship to environmental debates and controversies. And I think sociology has significant kinds of struggle to deal with the physical world, because one of the things it tended to do following Emile Durkheim was it presumed that it would study social facts as things, and that there was a realm of social facts kind of separate from biology, the physical world and so on. So it has required quite significant challenge and break with that tradition. So it's a sort of paradigmatic shift. But I think one of the areas which has helped that to happen is the sociology of science and technology, much reflected in and particularly developed in France and the UK, particular leading writers. And they, of course, bring out the importance of objects, that is a kind of physical world, that systems are both physical and human, that there are a range of different agents, and they contingently come to be assembled as significant entities, and they also contingently assembled then to move and to travel and so on. So that's a pretty significant shift, and that's one of the sort of the sources of this shift, is the contribution of science and technology studies. And the other area, I think, has been the analysis of consumption behaviour. It's obvious if you are analysing consuming, you're analysing the consuming in part of material objects and also of material places. And so the material, you can't sort of but think through those issues without thinking of the material, and to some extent also the embodied character of the social processes. So I think both science and technology and consumption behaviour kind of have forced this, or helped to force this paradigmatic shift for sociology, which is kind of no longer a pure realm of the social, and has kind of moved it into this, into thinking of the systems which connect human activity and the material world.